want to thank the Secretary for that gracious gesture. I want to start, Mr. Chairman, by, I believe, underscoring something you said in your opening statement. You said that we have invited Dr. Rice to talk to this 9/11 Commission. Well, we have a book issued by Richard Clarke, which is a blistering attack on the Bush administration. We have Dr. Rice on the airwaves saying that she strongly condemns and disagrees with Mr. Clarke's assessments and analysis. I would hope that this discussion would not be for the airwaves and would not be a partisan type of discussion that we have, but belongs in this hearing room tomorrow in a substantive way so that the 10 commissioners can ask factually based questions and so the American people have the access to those answers to try to make this country safer. So I would underscore your comments, Mr. Chairman, that I hope Dr. Rice will reconsider and come before our commission for the sake of the American people tomorrow. Madam Secretary, I want to mention your book, if I may. Madam Secretary, I don't need to mention a bestseller. You say in a chapter called A Special Kind of Evil that the African bombings, our embassies there, were the worst day of your tenure as Secretary of State. We lost 224 people, 12 Americans. The devil breathed down our neck that day, and 3 years later, 19 hijackers drove us into the jaws of hell, where we are today, trying to resolve some of these tough questions. The Clinton administration launched 79 cruise missiles 13 days after finding who did this. Had diplomacy run its course? Should we have taken the same kind of action that we took after the U.S. embassy bombings in Africa with the USS Cole?
Congressman Roemer, let me say that, as you pointed out, when the embassies were blown up, it was my worst day. I went to Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. In Nairobi, I saw the rubble and I saw the suffering of the African people, many of whom were in hospitals as a result of what had happened, and obviously many were dead. And I then brought the bodies home of the dead Americans and sat with the coffins and talked with the families when I came back. And so for me, this was a horrendous moment and one that I was bound and determined to figure out why it had happened and what we could do about it. I asked Admiral Crowe to form a commission to determine various actions that we could take, and it was something that was on my mind constantly. I was very much in favor of the attack with the cruise missiles and was very much in favor, along with the rest of our team, to try to do everything we could to have further military attacks if and when we had predictable and actionable intelligence. And as I say in my statement, I believed fully that we were prepared to go. President Clinton had issued all the orders. We had kept armed submarines in the Arabian Sea, and we were ready if there ever was actionable intelligence. And so I did favor military action. But at the same time, we had to continue to act diplomatically. I have always believed that what is necessary is to use every tool in the American national security arsenal, whether it is military, diplomatic, or economic, or legal, and we tried everything at the same time. On the USS Cole, we were obviously prepared to respond, but we did not have definitive evidence that it really was committed by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. That evidence came after we were out of office. But had we had definitive evidence, I can assure you that we were prepared to act militarily.
Let me ask you a question about that, Madam Secretary. There are 3 investigations going on with respect to the USS Cole. The Yemenis are doing one, the FBI is doing one, and the CIA is doing one. In December, the CIA comes forward, hedges the recommendation, comes forward with a preliminary judgment, and says they can't, through command and control, prove that Osama bin Laden ordered it. Isn't it enough at this point to say Al-Qaeda did it and respond in that kind of way, either in December or certainly in the months that come after your administration?
Well, I think the real question is to try to figure out what really did happen. And when we left office, we did not have all the answers to it. And as you point out, there were numerous investigations. I myself called the president of Yemen to help us in this issue and to press for additional investigations. I think the results came after we were out of office, and I would have hoped that action could have been taken. But there was no definitive action of any kind at the time that we left office.
In terms of the time that you spent as a Secretary of State on terrorism, we'll have Secretary Powell follow you. What percent of your time, if you can give us a rough estimation, did you spend? You had Middle East peace. You certainly were one of the driving forces in being a hawk with respect to Kosovo and using our military there. What percent of your time can you best estimate that you spent on counterterrorism policy?
It's very hard, Congressman, to give you an exact estimate, but I can tell you what I did, which is every morning when I came into my office, I obviously read the intelligence, but I also met with the Assistant Secretary for Security. I had changed the standard practice and named a law enforcement officer to that job, David Carpenter, who was a retired Secret Service agent, and so I had a real expert dealing with it. We spent whatever time was necessary in the morning in order to go over the threats. Then either I or Ambassador Pickering, depending upon who was in town, went to the small meetings that took place on counterterrorism issues. We talked about issues to do with terrorism, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda in so many meetings, whether they were official principals meetings at the White House or the breakfasts that Mr. Berger and Secretary Cohen and the
ABC breakfasts.
The ABCs were lunches. The breakfasts were a little bit larger with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Mr. Tenet and the ambassador of the United Nations. And so, but we talked about this constantly, and therefore it's hard to give you an estimate of the time, but it was very much...
Can you guess at all? 20%, 50%?
I would probably say somewhere about 35%, because it was something that was constant and it was very hard to quantify. But I can tell you I started every single day trying to assess what the terrorist threats were and also how to direct the diplomacy in order to be able to make sure that we were dealing with this. I think maybe Ambassador Pickering can also tell you how much time he spent on it, because our activities were seamless.
I think that Secretary's judgment in this, and she used to call me after the morning meetings and give me orders to carry things out and get things done. Given the number of meetings, particularly in crises periods leading up to the millennium, for example, sometimes most of the day would be occupied in dealing with this particular issue. And to all the meetings that the Secretary mentioned, she had many internal meetings in the State Department to plan for not only what she should do with the ongoing meetings at an interagency basis, but also to get us thinking about new ideas, thinking out of the hat on this issue, and trying to come up with new and different ways to deal with the problem.
So some days it was 100%. So I think it's very hard to give you a real percentage.
Let me, in my 15 minutes, move quickly through some things. I mentioned Secretary Powell will be coming next. I imagine you briefed Secretary Powell as he came into office in a transition. Did you let the Secretary know that Al-Qaeda was going to be the kind of threat that he would need to spend 35% or 50% or 100% in some days of his time fighting this new, fluid, dynamic threat to this country? And what was his reaction, or what was Dr. Rice's reaction to these types of briefings?
Well, let me explain a little bit of what happened in the transition in the State Department. Is something that is done many times and is well put together. So I had general meetings with Secretary Powell. Then when he moved into his offices in the first floor of the State Department, I arranged to make sure that every assistant secretary briefed him on whatever the issue was, and Ambassador Sheehan, who was in charge of counterterrorism, briefed Secretary Powell in detail about the kinds of things that we have been talking about in terms of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, etc. In my general discussions with Secretary Powell, I did point out that this was a major issue that had occupied a large portion of my time. But
how did he react to that?
Well, I think he understood that this was a serious issue, and I only know what I've read in terms of Mr. Berger's conversations with Dr. Rice, but I know that I believe that Secretary Powell understood the dangers that were inherent.
Let me move on to a very complicated relationship that the United States has with Saudi Arabia. I want to ask very bluntly and very frankly your opinion with regard to their cooperation to the United States, with the United States prior to 9/11. We were able to get the Saudis to cooperate on issues such as having Ambassador Turki go to yell at Mullah Omar in Afghanistan, but we could not get them to access al-Qaeda's CFO. What kind of relationship was this, and did you personally press the Saudis hard in these kinds of instances when we needed access to high-level people like Madani al-Tayyab?
I think, as you pointed out, our relationship with Saudi Arabia is a very complicated one, and the Saudi record is a mixed one, frankly. I think that they were helpful on a number of issues. I talked to Crown Prince Abdullah as well as Foreign Minister Saud about a number of issues, obviously including bin Laden and al-Qaeda. We also spent a lot of time on Iraq. And we spent a lot of time in terms of issues to do around the Middle East peace process. They always did say that they would press and push on the bin Laden al-Qaeda front, but frankly, it's hard to say how effective it was at what times.
Were you convinced they were pushing?
Well, I was convinced when they told me they were pushing, but the bottom line is that, in effect, as you look at the record, there were questions about some of the financial aspects, and I do think that there is a mixed record. One of the things about the Saudis is that they often do more things in private than is evident publicly, but I would say the record was a mixed one. I would say we pushed as hard as we could.
Let me ask you, Madam Secretary, in your book you say, and I quote, "Sadly, I was not surprised that we were attacked or even shocked that the airplane hijacking was involved," unquote. You were not surprised by that September 11th event, and did you have intelligence or briefings indicating that hijackings were possible on September 11th? Why weren't you surprised, and did it include not being shocked that planes were used as missiles and weapons, or that it was al-Qaeda?
A number of responses to that, Congressman. I think that we were operating within an atmosphere where we were watching all kinds of potential attacks, and in fact foiled a number of them in the years that we were in office. I kind of call them the dogs that didn't bite or bark because people didn't hear about them, but so I think that we were always on the lookout, which is why I said I wasn't surprised, because we knew that there were a variety of attacks possible, and we foiled some. In various briefings, we were told that there were all kinds of ways to do things, car bombs or suitcases or bio or chemical, and among the various parts of what we were briefed, there would be sometimes a mention of an airplane. But basically, we were looking at all kinds of potential ways that there could be attacks. And so the sadness of this was that we always knew that we were always on the lookout for some terrible thing, and we were foiling many of the potential attacks.
Madam Secretary, thank you very much. I've been slipped a note that my time has expired, and I want to stick right to that so that other commissioners can get in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman.